Great. Okay, so my name's Andrew Erdmann. I'm the manager at the Water Planning Program for the State Stream Commission. It's great to see some folks here that I know. It's good to see Sean. I haven't seen him since graduate school here long ago. But yeah, thanks everybody for being here for this. For those of you who are in the room, we brought a bunch of water bottles and some stuff that's left over from our meetings to kind of hand out. So please, we'll go through that stuff at the end. I also have Sara Fox here. The two of us are 2/3 of the planning team. So there's one other person, Amanda. She's out in Las Vegas touring the burn scar right now. But it's just the three of us who are the water planning program. And over the past couple years, we've been working on this water security planning act implementation. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. So, hey, okay. So Water Security Planning Act is what we're working on. It was passed in 2023. Last time we had one of our long 60-day sessions. And when I say passed, I mean we actually sat down with a whole bunch of people and wrote it and brought it to the legislature and presented it to the committees, and they voted for it and it got passed, which was great. Kind of a learning experience there. Although since it passed, I don't know how often I get to do this again. But it's basically a way to revisit regional water planning around the state, which is something we've done in the past a couple of times. Once in like the early 2000s was a culmination, at least, of that effort, and another time around 2016 or 17. The previous efforts to do planning were, in 1987, the goal was to prevent Texas from basically coming into New Mexico and claiming a whole bunch of water rights. It worked. That did not happen. So that was the goal of the Planning Act back in 1987. There's a lot more stuff that people are expecting from water planning in 2024 that they didn't know to expect back in 1987. So we're here with a kind of new update to all that statute to try and come up with a planning process that does a better job working for kind of more contemporary planning considerations. So the statute has a couple specific requirements. One is to ensure scientific integrity through best available science and data. Another is to support implementation. So making sure that stuff actually gets built coming out of this and that money gets distributed to communities. That was one of the challenges in previous rounds. Building on and incorporating existing planning efforts. So I suppose folks in this building know better than most, there are a lot of planning efforts going on all the time, all over the place. And water interacts with a lot of those. So one of the challenges for us is as we move around the state, learning what's already happening and making sure that we're integrating with all of that. Grounded in state water law, including respecting existing water rights. This is really here to be clear that we're not going to take anybody's water rights away with the planning process. Right. Oh, people are coming. Cool. And it's going to involve robust public engagement at every step of the way. So we're in the early steps, but we are definitely all in on the robust public engagement, and we're still working to do that. So for us to get good solutions, it really is going to take a lot of community engagement. Okay, so we got two graphs here on the screen. They both work the same way. Individual dots are individual years, and the horizontal lines are decadal averages. So like an average for the 90s, average for the 2000s, so on. The red dots, the red line tracks temperature, and you can see that's like stepping up pretty clearly, stepping up already over the last couple of decades. And then precipitation is pretty much all over the place. There is a huge range. Precipitation varies a lot in New Mexico. It's generally fairly low with large events. So individual really big events can have a huge impact on how much precipitation we get in a given year. In terms of future conditions, we're expecting that temperature to keep marching up for what we looked for the next 50 years is what the science this was based on, was a 50-year projection. They're expecting it to keep marching up over the next 50 years and for precipitation to continue to be all over the place. So the combination of those two things, the higher temperatures, this is average temperatures for the whole state too, which is kind of a weird concept, right? But basically it's getting warmer. That's partially because it's longer summer. So like earlier runoff, longer growing season, sooner, like earlier snowpack runoff, bigger peak events. There's really big rain events. So we're expecting things to kind of move in that direction. It's going to be 25% less surface water that's available 50 years from now. That trend doesn't end in 50 years. It's just our study that ends in 50 years. So we really think it's going to be something like a 5% reduction each decade, give or take, for the foreseeable future. So that's what we're trying to plan for. That's really challenging. Water planning in the past has really been able to like secure more water all the time, right? Like you think about people showing up in New Mexico, well, trying to start doing water work, like our agency's from 100 years old. So 100 years ago, we didn't have all the wells, we didn't have all the dams. Like we've been operating in a situation where we have more and more reliable access to water over that whole century. And this is kind of a tipping point where we're looking at that changing, which is going to take change in how we plan for things because it's a real different scenario. This map here kind of gives us like a regional sense of how this works. So New Mexico is not alone in it becoming drier. So quickly how this works, the places where it's brown are going to become drier, have increased water stress. The darker the brown, the greater the increase in water stress. Places that are blue are going to have the opposite of that, right? So they're going to have more water. As someone who's been looking at this and presenting this slide for like a year, the thing that has gotten to where it really jumps out at me is almost none of this map is white, right? That's the areas that aren't going to change. So to the extent that we're talking about like infrastructure investment and changing how we manage water, every place that has any color on this map is going to need to do that, whether it's because they have more or less water. It's going to be a challenge all over the place. The other thing you can see from here, and if we had Mexico colored, it would be also brown, is that we can't just jump over the border and run a pipe across the line to be able to bring in water from any of the neighboring states. All of the states around us would also like to do that, I'm sure. And the pipe has to go quite a distance to get to a place that has water. Okay, more context here for what we're working on with planning. So this is how our water gets used in New Mexico. Almost entirely for agriculture. It's about 80%, close to 80%. The farmers, if we had farmers in the room, and usually I do, but I have a feeling that might not be the case for this particular room, they would be quick to point out that, and correctly point out that we do a good job measuring how much water they like divert from rivers or pull out of wells to put on their fields. We don't do any measuring at all for how much of that goes back either into the aquifer or into a river. So some portion of that 77.5%, it's messy because some of that returned water gets used more than once. It's not getting measured, but it is probably less than 78, 80%. It is still for sure the largest water user. Public water systems use 10%. And that's like everybody on domestic wells, every single city that's providing water, every tiny mutual domestic, like all the drinking water, all the water coming out of the bathroom sink, all that.
Really quick.
We're trying to close this thing, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then if we can shrink that.
Totally we can.
All right. Perfect.
Sure.
Sorry,
everybody. Now you can see all my great text and my cheating is over. So, okay. So yeah, 10% for public water supply. Kind of similar to agriculture, that public water supply sends a lot of water back. So like we're in Albuquerque right now. I think it's about 62% of Albuquerque's water that they use and they run through their water system goes back into the river at the south end of town at the sewer plant. So agriculture and public water systems, they both return a fair amount of water also. Reservoir evaporation, this is why I'm making this point. Reservoir evaporation returns no water, right? That's our next large water user, 7.5%. That water is just gone, blew up into the air, blew over to Texas, it's gone. And then this last category is really a combination of a whole small categories. So IC&P is industrial, commercial, mining, and power. At a state level, these don't use very much water, all of them together. This is fracking, this is cooling towers for like power plants. They can be a really significant user at a local level. And this actually kind of goes to show why you kind of need to do planning at a couple of different levels here, right? Because when we look at this from the state level, we're working on the other 95%, right? But that 5% that goes into power and mining and fracking and all that stuff, those are really important to local communities. So from state level, not hugely significant, but on a local scale can be a lot. Okay, I don't know what to do about this rectangle here in the middle of the screen, but you can, it just exists. Okay. Hey, there we go. It exists somewhere else now. Okay. So this map can be kind of mesmerizing. This is like snapshot for each decade, looking at how many wells there are in the state, right? So each of those red dots is a well. They're basically well drilling technology is new. Wells feel really old. You have this sense of like the wooden crank or whatever. Perhaps people have been doing that for a long time, but nobody is depleting the groundwater one wooden bucket full at a time, right? That is not how this works. These are big wells that can, have a pump and they're pulling water out all the time. There's maybe 300,000 in the state. And as you can see, it kind of looks like an outbreak map or something. It's kind of terrifying, right? And part of what's important about this is we talk to folks who are on wells and they will be quick to point out that their well can't possibly have a very large impact. And they're totally right. The issue is that there's 300,000 of these small impact wells all over the place. So that's where the groundwater piece is really challenging. The other thing to be to notice about this is like, for anyone who's sort of familiar with the geography of New Mexico, if you were to just, put your finger on a spot on the map, odds are pretty good that you're nowhere near a river. So the ability to drill wells like this has allowed folks to move in communities to grow all over the state in areas that don't have particularly sustainable water supplies. And so now we're watching some of these groundwater levels drop. We're trying to figure out how to address this. Recharge is so low. It's a lot like the interest you're getting on your savings account, right? The idea that you're going to live on that interest, you'd have to have a lot of savings. Basically it's almost nothing, right? Like there's very little water that's actually infiltrating back in. It's nowhere near the rate it's getting drawn out. I wonder, I'm not going to try and get fancy here. It's going to make boxes appear. Another thing, just a specific issue that's kind of clear on this. So one of the areas where this is the most poignant of a problem is on the eastern side of the state. The aquifer that underlies that is the Ogallala Aquifer. It's basically the groundwater equivalent of the Mississippi River Basin. Underlies a lot of the country. People are pumping water out of that from Pennsylvania to Clovis. And so we are on the very shallow end of that aquifer. So we're seeing water tables drop a lot. The really staggering number I got from a guy in Texaco when we were out doing some meetings this year was that they have a municipal well that when they drilled it, it had 80 feet of water in the bottom that they could pump out of, and now it has 2. And that was 30 years ago. So, oh yeah. Cool. So, sorry, it's my wife just walked in and I'm totally distracted here. So, yeah, so that eastern side of the state, they have a huge challenge. They have certainly been using a lot of water historically themselves, right? Out of all these red dots that are in that section of the state. But also most of their aquifer is to the east of them, right? So even if they were to completely stop using their wells, their water is still going to run under the border to Texas and their aquifer is going to dry up. There's a pipeline project being built right now. And that has been true during the entire life of every single person in this room, because it's been underway since the early 1960s, to provide water from Ute Reservoir, which was built specifically for this purpose in the 60s, to bring water through this pipeline over to like Clovis and Portales. The reason I'm mentioning this is just to give a sense of how big the scale is on those projects, right? So if you're looking to like build like a pipeline solution, you need a river nobody's using, you need 65 or 70 years, and you need maybe $10 billion. And that's today, like if you were paying for it now. So I guess if you were starting now, I can't even begin to imagine what the increase is going to be 60 years out for the cost on those things. But it is a really big deal to build these pipelines and move water around. So groundwater. So what we're trying to do with our planning process here is to kind of balance water availability with water need. So this is a lot different than the way we've solved this in the past, which was to increase water availability, right? That's how we've dealt with this before. Frankly, we're really working to focus on this idea of balance and kind of living in balance. That's sort of how we're doing the framing for our planning work because we think it's a good way to talk about it and trying to be balanced, but also because the other way, the more traditional way to talk about this is like supply and demand. And one of the challenges for that, people know a ton about supply and demand from money, and not all of that applies, and some of it does. It's very hard to tease those things apart. And also people have kind of strongly held and kind of almost like political identification kind of values around supply and demand. So that also makes it hard to kind of have a real straightforward discussion about how to fix the problem. People go straight to supply side solutions or straight against them, and then they fight with each other. So that hasn't proved to be very productive. So we're really trying to focus on, scaling and matching availability to need. So this is how we're doing that, this Water Security Planning Act. So as I mentioned, we passed it in early 2023, and that was great, went through the legislature. It erased the entire existing statute, which included everything about how regional planning is done. So like the regional boundaries that we're working on for planning is part of that old statute, all that got thrown out. In 2024, we've been doing a ton of public and tribal input collection, and we've also been creating this sort of additional lane for tribal leadership and the Indian Affairs Department to work on making sure that tribal voices are part of this. Part of what's really essential about that for water rights specifically, and I'm sure it's true for lots of other broader planning things, but the Pueblos, tribes, and nations in the state for sure have the most senior water rights in the state. And so as we're looking at a situation where there are smaller and smaller amounts of water available, and we do live in like a senior water right, it's better to have a more senior water right. Lots of their water rights were established many hundreds of years before all of the ones that are part of the United States Administration of Water. So that's what we're working on now in 24. As we move into 2025, we're going to be finalizing rules and guidelines. So all the public input that we collected in 24, that's all designed to turn into a rule set. And it's both rules and guidelines, which is sort of terms of art in terms of how state law works. The rules are just shorthand, like written in stone. They go through this very formal promulgation process. They're really hard to change once established. Guidelines function like rules, easier to change because we just have to bring them forward to the Interstate Stream Commission. So in terms of what's addressed in these, we have things that really need to stay permanent in the rules, and they are important, but also need to be flexible in the guidelines. So in 2025, we will be going through we'll have some public input opportunities, and we'll be finalizing those rules. And when we will be starting to do the actual regional planning. Part of not knowing what the boundaries are is I don't know how many regions we're going to have. We previously had 16. The former state engineer has told us that he wanted us to have more like 9. The senator who sponsored this wants us to have more like 50. That's a pretty big range. So we're somewhere in the middle of that, right? And it's going to matter where we are specifically in terms of how we kind of tackle this. But we will start with a manageable number of those regions, maybe 3 or 4 of them at a time, and kind of start developing those regional plans. And by 2028, we think the first round of that should be done. So the first 4 regions that we start with should have their plan, and we should have a fairly usable template that we can use to kind of keep doing regional planning starting in 2029 and beyond. And throughout all that, this Tribal Advisory Council is going to continue to weigh in on projects. Here's a little more information about the Tribal Advisory Council. So right now we're trying to get it started. Trying to gin things up from scratch is hard and it takes volunteers. So we're in this interim committee phase. The main difference between the interim committee and the Tribal Advisory Council is that we're basically relying on folks from tribes like being willing to like volunteer their time to show up and help us scope out how this is going to work and what the role of tribes is going to be long term. We're also working with the Indian Affairs Department, which is a state agency. It's a tiny state agency, though, that runs a ton of money through it and has a ton of responsibility. So we are a much larger agency. We're kind of carrying a lot of that load because they're just stretched really thin in terms of staffing. And we're hoping to get to the point where we have the full-blown Tribal Advisory Council stood up. We have some bylaws that we're drafting right now. A lot of this stuff comes down to like how representation works and how many people there are. We're working with 24 different tribes. That includes a couple of nations, however many pueblos there are. And then there's some tribal entities that are neither nations nor pueblos that are just tribes. I don't mean the just, they're tribes. And so trying to figure out the representation for that is one of the challenges. And it really, really comes down to this list that says things like 1 person from the Navajo Nation, 3 people from the Middle Rio Grande Pueblos, 2 people from the Northern Pueblo. Like it's this very prescriptive process. So that's what we're kind of hammering through on this right now. So, what we've done so far in terms of outreach events, this has like been the bulk of work that we've been doing over the last year. We did 16 open house events all over the state. The map of the old planning regions that got thrown out that was there from 87 had 16 regions, and we went back to each of them to hold a meeting and talk about how we should redraw the regions and how we should reconsider who stakeholders are. Frankly, I felt like we really needed to do this to kind of keep our promises. As an agency, we last were there in like 2016, 2017, and we promised up and down that we'd be back in 5 years. And 8 years later, we came back to tell them we are never coming back. We're going to draw new boundaries, and it's going to be a different process moving forward. So in order to try and do that, and be respectful of all the work that's gone into the previous plans and all the folks who live in those regions, we did that in each of the existing regions. The events we have a slide coming up that can show you more about how the specific events work. We also had a website, that's mainstreamnm.org website. That's why we have all these water bottles and stuff to make everyone go to our website. But that also has been really effective, frankly, more effective than we expected. We had the survey up there. There were better than, I don't know, 1,000 people who filled out the survey online. We got about 800 more in person, which is great. Our previous round of planning, we got less than 100 people total. So it's a huge leveling up on that. Use all this to be the basis for the rules that we're going to propose that we talked about on that timeline. This is just shamelessly Sarah and I just showing off that we did a whole bunch of work and went all over the state. This was the schedule for all the different regions we visited. It felt like a lot longer than 5 months, frankly, to go through this process. Public meetings are exhausting, and going on these kind of road shows where you do 3 in a row can be a lot. So I'm not going to do it out of order because my slide's not there. So the way these meetings worked, it's an open house, so people could come in at any time. That was the goal. It's hard to figure out how to set up a specific time for a meeting. There's this whole debate of like, if you hold it after work, you're really imposing on people. If you hold it during work, you're only catching the professionals who work in the field. So we tried to kind of span that and run these from like 3 to 7, and you could show up whenever, and you could probably be out of there in as fast as 15 minutes if you really put your head down and went through the questions. And a lot of people did this, you could show up and stick around and talk to the neighbors and really engage with the stuff, which was great. One of the things we didn't expect about this meeting format, like we had thought the trade-off would be, we'll do these open houses. It'll be great because it's easier for people, but we won't get as much conversation between people. And we were kind of ready for that trade-off. We actually got a lot more conversation between people than we expected. So I don't think that trade-off was as big of a deal as we were concerned on the way in. I will say there was a very vocal minority of people who really wanted to have like big public meetings, like me doing this, standing up there with a PowerPoint, and people, probably angry ones in the audience, getting ready to like yell at me afterwards about how poorly we were doing this and why were we making this so complicated. So those people were not happy with our process, but by and large, everybody else was. So here's just some stats. This is more just shameless bragging from Sarah and I about how effective the website was. But we did get, I don't even know what impressions are, so we're skipping that. But we had 72,000 people go visit the website during the time that it was up collecting input. We had a whole bunch of newspaper stories around the state. Sara was on the radio a couple times getting interviewed, which was pretty cool. Our biggest meeting was actually at the like continuing education building here at UNM, and we got, I don't know, like 150 people. How many? 120 people. It was pretty overwhelming. There were like radio stations with the crazy arm thing out front and stuff, which was new for me. I hadn't had that at a planning meeting before. So yeah, that doesn't happen very often. We have a newsletter up there. So if anybody actually is interested in being involved in some of this stuff, if you sign up for the newsletter, you will definitely hear when there are future public input opportunities coming. And we're certainly not out there selling these addresses to anybody. So and we have a great series of blogs that are up there too. So we've had a lot of people go read them. We've been really trying to focus on these blog stories to some extent because it's going to be hard. Like if we're going to try and look at a world where people have less water, and you're going to have to like coordinate with your neighbors to figure out who's going to get projects built, who's going to share water, like everybody wants somebody else to lose, right? Nobody wants to be the person who has to do that, has to give anything up. we'll see how it works, but we're really feeling like kind of stories that highlight, situations that real people are having around the state is a good way to get some compassion and sympathy so that people are able to kind of move into these discussions like a little more openly rather than kind of getting together with the people who have the same water use as them and fighting the people with a different water use, which is kind of a traditional way to do this. Okay, so the rules I've been talking about, here's what they're going to address: the boundaries and number of regions. So we'll have a new map that we'll be putting out there of what the new regions are going to look like. How the Interstate Stream Commission approves regional water plans. So like what has to be in the plan for the Stream Commission to look at it and say, yeah, that's good, we approve it, this is the official plan, what that kind of menu looks like. The procedure for water planning entities to develop and notify the ISC of public welfare issues. So this is like a term of art, and the fifth one relates to this too. The procedure to consider public welfare values in future generations. There's no reason everyone here should know this, but public welfare is like a very specific term in New Mexico water law. So public welfare is this criteria where you can potentially deny a water rights application if it's in violation of public welfare. Sounds like a great tool, except there's no definition of public welfare, so nobody's ever actually denied a permit for this reason. So this is an opportunity to kind of do that, to come up with a definition of that could work. And we don't know exactly what that will mean in terms of considering them, because truly the law has been on the books forever, but there's never been a definition. So we just haven't been able to use that. But more than ever, it seems like that's going to be important. It's a huge empowerment for the regional planning entities that will be created. And then the last piece here is composition of the regional water planning entities. So that's another thing that might come down to a list, not unlike the one I described with WISTAC, right? Maybe it's one farmer, one guy from or one person from a water provider, somebody from an ecological group. Like, we're just working to make sure that it's not exclusionary and that it's designed in a way that can allow it to make decisions and move forward. Second half of this is what the guidelines are going to address. So this is the stuff that's a little more flexible, requires some effort if we want to change these, but these could change over time. So how stakeholders are identified is one of these requirements for public input. So making sure that these things are not just that group of 7 people holding up in a room and making these decisions for their whole region. The process for approving grants and loans for planning. So trying to make sure we can get money out on the ground to keep, like, it's not just the regional planning entity, but like, so Albuquerque will be part of a larger entity that includes this whole region. So within that, we're hoping to be able to give grants and loans for planning work to groups like Albuquerque, like within the entity, like participants inside of it. So this is the procedure for that. The metrics for reporting, so how we're going to know if this is working or not. And the procedure for scheduling these and implementation. So making sure that we actually build some stuff, and also that these plans don't just get stale on the shelf. And I don't know, I mean, the thing you always hear about plans is they just sit on the shelf. To some extent, I don't know what people expect them to do, right? It's like a book, but we're really making sure that even though they're on the shelf, they are continuing to be relevant and updated, and that if we go through and start funding the projects that are identified in those, that we're meeting the current needs of that community. So here's the one I was looking for that shows how the open houses worked. So this is a picture from the Albuquerque meeting down in the bottom left. Basically, we still have draft on all these because this is all part of a report that's not quite out yet. Gosh, somehow we managed to cut off one of our photos here. But so the way it worked, people come in the room, they could circle around the outside. There's sort of stations set up to weigh in on different aspects of water planning. Our thinking with that was that people would have some things they were interested in more than others, but I think actually most people went through the whole process. And then you could kind of work your way around the outside of the room. We had staff stationed at different places to engage with folks and talk about the details and figure it out. And some of the voting is done with these dots where you kind of just fill in the sheet and you get kind of just overwhelming numbers for what people want to see. Some of it, like in the top right, it's sort of handwritten. So people are putting in specific comments that are really detailed. And some of it really is just talking with people. There was a lot, like you can see in this Albuquerque meeting. Actually, I'm pretty sure that's Sean's wife in the Albuquerque meeting photo right there. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so that's how the meetings work. That's what that looked like. We did shamelessly take photos of any dogs who showed up in bandanas. So as we get the findings for all this together, we're putting it into a dashboard. It feels like everything's a dashboard these days. But we're not getting left behind. We have a dashboard as well. It's going to help you look through the findings from all of this. The way that this works, and will be up mid-month next month, hopefully a little bit sooner than that, but middle of November, this should be up on that mainstream website. So you can see that map of New Mexico. Those are the 16 regions from the previous round of planning. The colors on those correspond to the colors in those graphs. So you can kind of get a relative sense of how people voted for each different region. If I had the live version up, you can click on an individual region and kind of just show the results from that one. One of the interesting pieces of this that happened that we didn't anticipate is that the way we figured out where people are from is to ask them their zip code, right? If you showed up at a meeting in Clovis, we know you're from roughly that region. But if you filled it out online, the way that we were able to kind of code where people were from is based on zip code. And we had a lot of people who weren't from New Mexico. And my guess, all of our guess, is that they really do live in New Mexico, but it's somebody who moved here. So when you ask them where they're from, they're like putting the zip code that's like their I don't know, soul zip code or whatever you call that. You know, and so that's kind of weird because when you add up all the numbers, it doesn't total to 100% based on just looking at the map. In case anyone looks at that and thinks we did a terrible job with the math, it's not us, it's math. But that was an interesting kind of piece that we had from some folks, and be a really nice tool to kind of give some transparency to what we're doing with all the findings we had. In addition to that dashboard, we're going to have 3 reports that come out really, really soon. There's an engagement summary report. This is pretty much a report that says, you know, here's how the meetings worked. Here's where the meetings were held. Here's all the feedback we got from the meetings, like just almost like raw data about how that worked, just to make sure everyone has access to that. It has some summary of this. I think this popped up because there's a thing in the chat. Oh, nope, sorry. I'm stealing your questions here. Okay, second piece here is an observations and considerations report. So this is really like a synthesis of that first report prepared for us by a contracting team out of Colorado. And I don't even have that on mine, so I can't make it go away for it. So this report is going to be like a little more, it's considerations, like almost recommendations from the contractor based on what they heard for what we should put in the rules. It was my boss who had the idea that we should really write this report. This report should be written from an outside contractor rather than from inside the agency, because they have a lot more flexibility to promote things that would be more problematic if we just sort of owned them as a state agency. So the outside contractors can say things that are totally true, like 72% of the people in the state want to have hydrologic boundaries, and therefore we should. And those of us who work at state agencies are a little cringy about that, because it's really hard to fund stuff that cross cuts across a bunch of different administrative boundaries. Like when you have like the Pecos River Basin runs across, I don't know, 8 different counties, and it runs across them in totally random ways. It isn't like they're all fully within that. So that can be really hard administratively. So one of the upsides of having somebody from the outside write the report is they're not conditioned by all that concern and consideration, so they can just really give us the straightforward information. And then the third piece here is going to be a summary report. It's going to be put together by a communications firm here in Albuquerque called Media Desk. Seems like a cool company. It's going to be a lot shorter, like a legible version. Those first 2 are, I don't know, north of 150 pages each. The third one is like a magazine, right? So we're really going to have it be kind of like high-level takeaway stuff, lots of graphics, easier to digest, a way to kind of explain this whole process to someone who's just learning about the process. The first 2 are provide accountability to folks who came to the meetings and make sure that we're being respectful of their time and comments, and also for the real water wonks of the state who just want to make spreadsheets about water. And there's a larger group of those people than you might think. All right. So next steps. Clearly we wrote this in the summer when that was still in the future, but we've wrapped up that first piece of this where we had the open house events and the online open house. This fall, we're doing evaluating all that feedback. We're getting all these reports finalized and ready. We're getting a set of what we're calling pre-draft rules drafted. Sara and I were just working on that yesterday. the language on this is a little awkward, and the reason is that when we get these rules and we bring them forward for finalization, that will be rule promulgation. It is a very formalized process. It has a lot of really strict requirements, 60 days for this, 45 days, has to publish in certain papers. It's all very important, but we're trying to get our rules in really good shape before we get to that point, because it's hard to make edits within that really formal process. So we're putting out all these rules as a draft early on so we can get feedback and incorporate all that through a whole round of feedback before we do the whole promulgation. So we'll be doing that fall and winter, sometime late winter. I don't know, in the spring, we'll start the full-blown promulgation. So I think that's, well, I'm not even going to put a date on it. I'm going to stick with spring. So so that at that point, we'll be moving through this formal process that'll result in the final rules. I promise this is the last slide and I can talk to people instead of just lecturing here. So ways to get involved in and around New Mexico. There's a lot of upcoming input opportunities. 2 of them are here. Truly, I think the best way to know when these are coming would be to go to that mainstream website and sign up for that newsletter. We don't send out a whole lot of newsletters that will let you know when those opportunities come up. There are additional public input opportunities associated with a bunch of work that NMED is doing. That's the Environment Department. They have stuff on their website. It is more than we have on this whole slide, which is why we couldn't recreate that list here. There's a climate adaptation and resilience plan coming out from Robert Gomez's group. That's part of the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Division. That's another state agency. And then there are so many statewide water conferences and local water conferences. So we just have a couple that are right around the corner listed here, one next week and one the week after that. So they really do come that fast all year round. You don't have to wait long if you want to sit with a bunch of wonky water people and talk about this kind of stuff. And then we have down here, consider applying for a job with the state, because Sarah's a big optimist and she built this slide. So, but yeah, also, there are jobs at the state. There's a horrible website to get through, but if you can survive the website, it's uphill from there. So that's the good news about those jobs. And with that, yeah, that's our slides and presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions or not if anybody wants to talk about any of this. Oh yes, and we also have our swag in the back here, a bunch of water bottles and bandanas, and Sarah's got these business cards that have I don't even know what those codes are called, that you scan with your camera on your phone to take you into the website and everything. So yeah, so please take some of that as well, because it is all left over from those meetings we did over the summer. So you are not depriving anybody of anything. Please take some. But yeah, I don't know.
I have to say, I've been flipping through this.
Oh, cool.
It is absolutely mind blowing how much information is in there.
Yeah.
It's just, kind of like dizzy from the.
Yeah.
But wow, it's just so amazing now. All this place and really well done.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. For anyone who's online, what he was just showing me is it's this climate change adaptation report. Has a really long name. We mostly call it the Leap Ahead report. It's great. Came out from New Mexico Tech in, I think, 2022, but it has all these different sections that talk about the climate impacts. All the stuff I said about 25% less water and change in climate is all in there with a great deal more detail. And there's a lot of other stuff in there as well about all sorts of other aspects of
climate mainstream and
sweet
website.
Yeah, we have a bunch of reports up on that website, and yeah, thanks. Yeah, cool. So
you guys, it's super robust, the work you're doing. And I'm just curious, do you feel like counterparts in neighboring states like Texas and Arizona and Utah are taking a similar approach?
Yeah, actually I do. We've had a chance to talk with a bunch of neighboring states. The Santa Fe Home Builders Association actually flew in our equivalents from all those states, and also, well, maybe just all those states: Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Texas. And so Colorado is kind of famous for being ahead of everybody else on this. They have surface water as a dominant source of their state. Their regions are based on watershed boundaries. They have basin roundtables, is what their kind of governing boards are called. They're maybe 25 years deep in this process.
Yeah, essentially, both just the roundtables and our initial planning programs were kind of going on 2000 route. I'm gonna be in Colorado and stuff, so like, they just put a lot of funding behind that, and we
Yeah.
don't get as much, so they're, you know, just further ahead down the line, they've done multiple rounds of their regional planning and their statewide planning, and they're really kind of throwing it in a way that, you know, we're talking about our counterparts in those states and being able to take their lessons learned for us and this thing.
Yeah, that's totally right. I mean, they tied it to the specific funding source, which is like sports betting, which turns out to be way more lucrative than anybody expected it to be. So that turns out to have been great for water planning in Colorado. Arizona has a pretty interesting program too. So they don't have region in the same way. They have this kind of cool layered approach. So they're in a lot of groundwater like us. Everybody in the state is part of a groundwater management basin. Some of those areas are also part of a surface water management basin. Some of those are interstate connected surface water basins, and some of those are part of interstate connected surface water basins that have endangered species. So they have this kind of layering up that they do in Arizona, which seems really nice. Yeah, they have a lot of control, which is totally unique to Arizona. Utah is very much kind of getting started now, but Utah, when they get started, they just take off running. And Colorado has kind of gone through this for years. So, I mean, Utah's doing a little bit of what we're doing and learning from Colorado's experience, and that's faster, you know, than having to do it yourself. And actually, Texas, I mean, it's tempting to think Texas doesn't have this dialed, but they do. They have a really great website for their state water planning program. You can get a ton of data from that. There's not as much regulation in Texas. So in terms of their ability to like make changes to stuff, it's a little bit different than those other states, but the planning team's got some really rigorous work that they've done to pull things together for all those states. Yeah.
It's very successful getting like these plans in, they're very successful at moving them from plan.
Yeah, they're really good. They're really closely tied. Like you propose something and it can get funded and built more quickly in Texas than in those other states. Yeah, I can't even see anybody online, so maybe I should stop sharing this and see if anybody online has questions too. Oof, mostly me. So okay.
So are there plans, or is it available once it goes live for data to be downloaded off of the dashboard? Or could a request go to you guys? So just
for sure, a request could go to us and we would be sure to get it for you. No one has actually asked about downloading stuff off the dashboard, which is why I don't know what the answer to that is, but we should make that available as well. But we're happy to share the information in a easier to access way than a 200-page report. We can give you spreadsheets and stuff for sure. And that'd be great, actually, if somebody wanted to dig into that and give us some other perspectives. That would be fantastic. So yeah, so I'm like looking around in case people have questions, but I feel like I'm just like making eye contact to scare you into asking. So you don't have to do that. Yeah, and everybody online, if you have a question, please, I don't know, ask it. Anything to make my face go away on there. Oh, thank you so much. There we go. Great. Okay.
Yeah, why do you think this round was so much more successful in terms of public engagement than previous iterations?
I mean, one big thing is that we have more funding. The state's got more funding than it had 15 years ago or 10 years ago even. The 2016 ones were the last round of plans. And it didn't get much additional funding at all. We had the opportunity to work with a bunch of contractors to do some of this, and the availability of doing that, I think, is kind of a reflection of the fact that people are more interested in planning than they have been in the past. It was pretty easy for me to convince management to invest in doing this in a more robust way. But I'm pretty sure if I had this job in 2016, I wouldn't have done any better than they did, because there wasn't as much of a will to get all that public engagement. And we've really emphasized that, like, so what the legislators have told us they need from this is sort of a prioritized list of projects for each of the regions, right? So that when they go to fund projects, They don't find themselves with hundreds and hundreds of projects with individuals who are promoting them and trying to advocate on behalf of those, and they can only fund part of many of those projects and still send everyone away unhappy. They really would prefer to have a list that's straightforward. They can start and fund the first thing on the list and fund the second, and kind of move as far down the list as their funding enables them to go. For that to work, there has to be pretty broad consensus in the region, because if we can put a list together, but if there are still getting 200 calls from people who live in their region that the specific project that they care about isn't on the list, it's not going to work. So, and this is the exact same thing I have said over and over to get the support to be able to do broader outreach. Is like, we really need to get everybody in the room, because if they're not there and their project doesn't show up because they didn't know this process was happening, they will be assertive and contact their legislator and say, you know, I don't know what that list is, but our project is something else and we also need some funding. And if that happens, the list isn't working as well as it was supposed to. So yeah, I think that's why. And I'll say to the first round, the like way back round, they didn't have the intentions of doing a whole lot of project allocation through that. It really was for kind of protecting water from Texas and just getting the plans in place. It feels kind of cynical saying it now because it feels like such a box checking exercise, but I get the sense that if we had not done that, we would be looking at a real different water landscape in the state, and Texas would be a player internally in New Mexico, and it's not. So that was pretty successful. Cool.
Say, having worked on the Erdmann resilience plan, as you guys know.
Yeah.
You jump starting with such a robust going into communities made our job easier when we hit some of the same communities, because they have been through the process with you. So this is a big thank you for going into the communities with this strong open house forum or format that really allowed a month later for us to hit the same communities, looking at wildfire, looking at flooding, not just water issues, in a much, like, we felt like the communities have been primed by you guys, which, thank you for doing that.
Sweet, thank you. That feels great, yeah.
Yeah, because it was awesome to be able to go into communities that they were ready for that type of format, and the soapbox community format that they were used to.
That's great to hear. We got a lot of really good feedback about the format, and I think a lot of the legislators got really good feedback about it, which is great for supporting the work that we're doing moving forward. And it looks great as we're working on kind of interpreting that data and working with it. We felt pretty good about that, but that's great to know that it worked well for MNERD coming in.
Yeah.
Next time we just have to have enough time to be able to coordinate, so we don't show up a month apart, but show up together and figure out how to do those things even more synced up. But there's always a little bit more we could do, I suppose.
Any big surprises or takeaways?
That's a good question. I mean, one surprise is kind of the overwhelming, like the things that people ask for are like there's a huge amount of support for hydrology-based boundaries, more than we expected, like 70-something%, like I was saying. So that was kind of unexpected. There's a huge amount of support for things like making sure we have enough water for future generations. I don't know that I'd say it's really a surprise, but it's really nice because those are hard things.
Nice.
Yeah, it's hard to like bring that up when you're like trying to negotiate with someone who might have to
The kids will be thirsty.
use less water right now, or build a smaller houses in their subdivision, or I don't know, put in like some kind of restrictive ordinances or something. So it's great to have some statistics that kind of back up some of the stuff we knew, like people care about the future and their children. Like, I mean, of course they do, but it's nice to be able to point at a number and say, we asked them, they care 83%, right? You know, like it's so that was great too. I don't know. Do you think there were any other surprises? Sorry, I couldn't think of any, so I gave you the hard question. So
in general, most people were really willing to be open to this process, and I didn't get yelled at as often as I thought.
That's how it was.
It's always plus. I mean, I was yelled at. There was like some situations where I was like, ooh. This isn't great, but on the whole, we in general met people. Maybe it's just like a self-selected people who decide to become a public open to that. But in general, people were willing to show up and like willing to kind of engage with different ideas, especially around this boundaries concepts. And I listened to arguments why you maybe don't want technology for one. she got very good, I got very good at making, because I managed the rounding section for most students.
Yeah, and that was super helpful. Sarah was particularly good at that, but so were some of the other people, just trying to make sure people slow down enough to consider some of the other things that they hadn't come in already thinking, right? Because it's like, I don't know. I mean, other people have good ideas too, right? So it's kind of nice to just take a moment, even if you do stick with exactly what you were planning to do when you walked in, to just sort of wrap your head around why you might not do that, or why somebody else might choose to vote differently on the same issue. But yeah,
Mind going a little deeper into that, just so for those of us who aren't as
Yeah.
aware.
well, so for example, like the hydrology boundaries, right? Like, so watershed boundaries, I mean, I'm assuming, well, I shouldn't assume anything. So watershed boundaries, this is like a watershed, a surface water area, right? Where if you kind of like, the whole thing kind of funnels into a single river, right? So that's what we're looking at. So there's like the big ones in the state. There's like the Rio Grande Basin, the Pecos Basin, San Juan Basin up in the northwest. Makes a ton of sense to use hydrologic boundaries, but you can make a pretty strong case for other ways of doing things. So for example, and this is one I heard Sara do a bunch of times, everyone who lives at the top of a watershed, no matter what watershed it is, in New Mexico, that means you're basically next to some really tall forests. And one of the biggest issues for you in terms of water management is fires. So instead of having hydrologic based boundaries, you almost might want to just do a circle around kind of the areas where there's a bunch of mountains. Doesn't matter if they drain to the east or the west. Everybody who's adjacent to those mountains has a really shared interest in not seeing all of that burn. And that could affect, that might allow them to tackle that more aggressively with their regional plan. Another way of looking at it would be to think like the Navajo Nation is spread across a couple different watersheds, some of which, well, the San Juan River has a ton of water, way more than anybody else, and the rest of it has no water at all. So if you break it up hydrologically, you've taken this really unique and intact kind of cultural group and split them. And so you might choose not to do that, right? It might be more important to try and keep like that kind of culturally intact, because that's a group of people who make decisions together all the time anyway. They've got their own nation, right? Like they've got a president, like it makes sense to not carve that up. To a lesser extent, that's also true with things like acequias, right? Like the acequias in the Mora Valley drain into the Pecos River. The acequias in like Española and stuff, they drain into the Rio Grande. You'd be separating those communities. But the acequias are facing similar concerns, right? Most of the acequias don't have any reservoirs. They're right on the side of these mountains. And so if you kind of drew the boundaries in a way that put all of them together, it could help them aggregate those considerations. Clearly, even though we came up with these compelling arguments, it didn't work because we had overwhelming support for the hydrologic boundaries. But there are some kind of compelling ways to look at it in a different way. And it's true for some of the other stuff. The boundaries are just way easier to talk about.
Sure. Easier to visualize too, like boundaries.
Yeah, right, because it's such a tangible thing, imagining doing differently. But yeah, so there's a lot of stuff like that where we could just sort of say, well, just for your consideration, if you really want to be with the people who live close to you, I mean, the Pecos Basin includes Carlsbad and Las Vegas, which don't feel particularly closely linked by anything other than that river. But they are quite linked by that.
What were some of the reasons behind the strong support for hydrologic?
I think it's because people, I mean, they make sense, and you can kind of figure out like the water budget for those areas and figure it out. And there's also like, there's impacts when you do one project in a watershed, the other users in that watershed are potentially impacted by that, even if it's far away. Like, so Las Vegas is super far from Carlsbad, but those fires they had in Las Vegas, that ash is just working its way through all the reservoirs going down the Pecos, and Carlsbad is definitely going to get to deal with that before too long. I mean, actually, they're dealing with terrible flooding right now. But yeah, so that's one of the compelling reasons. Or if you're like in a groundwater basin, so that's another type of hydrologic thing. Like all those folks, actually, you weren't here yet. We talked a little bit about the eastern side of the state being on the Ogallala, and that aquifer is going away. That's a pretty unique problem to have. It's far to be like on the Colorado border or the Texas border on the eastern side of the state. But both of those communities are facing this issue of like, oh, most of our aquifer is across the border, and that other state is definitely going to drink all this water, whether we use it or not.
Yeah.
So they might want to be together to try and help prioritize that as their top priority for what to tackle.
Has there been like initiatives? We noticed with the wells, 300,000 that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Is there any initiative with those folks to maybe recycle? I know I saw a company out of California called Capture 2.0
Yeah.
And where they were capturing the water, I'm not sure, using it for, to grow vegetables with the local gardens or, you know, whatever. But, I mean, if, I know that when we use water, we're not really sure we're replacing it, in our office, but if there's an effort to try to make sure that that happens with those folks, have those wells, if that's been brought up or, you know, it's not good.
Yeah, it's definitely been brought up and we're trying to figure out how to do a good job with it. The aquifers are a lot different, right? Some people are 800 feet above the water table and you can pour water on the ground, but it's going to be a while before it goes 800 feet down and gets back there. And some places aren't, right? It's a lot closer. So that interaction's a lot closer. So it's going to take some like local flexibility to be able to make sure you're scaling those things appropriately to whatever the situation is right there. But there's a ton of interest in doing it. One of the things that we're working on our team is putting like, there's a lot of folks who are on wells all by themselves on their house out in the middle of nowhere. Anything you can do to leave water in the ground and use a little bit less of it will extend the life of that home and the ability of people to live in that area. So we're really working on trying to target some conservation programs that we could apply. Like there's great conservation programs in cities because cities can basically, like if they're sending less water to your house, they can send it to somebody else's house to build another house, right? There's money in that for them. It's a little bit harder on the wells because it's not quite that. It's more like you're just saving the water for the future. But we're working to put numbers together so that when the state proposes, you see these really big ticket projects, right? Like that pipeline that's counting in the billions. You could put a lot of really efficient water appliances in people's house for a couple $100 million, right? Like that could go a long way. So we're working on how to dial that in. And there's some awesome companies doing work that is pretty innovative in a lot of different ways on how to do it. So we're trying to figure out how to plug the right technology into the right parts of the state, but it's early days still. So we haven't quite got it figured out yet. Yeah.
But one thing with this process that we're hoping that these things that maybe are traditional like full concrete types of projects will come through with this regional planning process so that we can propose how we're gonna replace all the toilets in our area, like water saving toilets, and that could be like a project that could be funded through this process. So trying to leave it open enough that like not all projects are like sitting around on concrete places.
Yeah.
There's one comment in the chat.
Oh, thanks. Segmenting communities / interest groups by hydrologic boundaries seems like a really tricky thing that could generate more competition and ill will. I think Elizabeth's absolutely right about that, which is a big part of why we're trying to be really careful with this. It's hard. I mean, frankly, Sarah and I've spent like the last 18 months, every time a map goes up that's like divides the state in different ways, we're like, what is that? How does that work? Like, what was the principle for these polygons, right, that divided up the state? And one thing I've realized is there's just tons. There's so many different ways that the state's broken up, from like counties to council of government districts to soil and water conservation districts to the district offices for each of the state offices. Which one? Voting districts? Yeah.
The overlays that we had made that really clear. How
Yeah, thanks.
different all those
Yeah.
boundaries were.
The
Thanks.
manifestation wasn't fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's 2 minutes left.
Great. So I didn't run out of time too soon then. This
Yeah.
was about right.
No, so if there's any last questions, otherwise we're gonna sign off. And let these guys eat.
What, I'm like looking at
There's
this.
some cool questions.
Cool.
Well, thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
thanks so much.
We really appreciate it.
Scared to